Boys in the Valley is a horror thriller set at the turn of the century. Most of this story takes place in 1905. It takes place at a remote boys' orphanage in rural Pennsylvania, where these boys kind of live together as family, and they're overseen by these small group of priests, and they kind of are trying to find their way to get through every day. And they're malnourished and they're cold and they're, they're your outcasts of society. And then one stormy night, something comes to the orphanage doors, and it brings something that none of them were expecting, and it's an evil that permeates the orphanage, and the boys find themselves changed to a degree, and they find themselves sort of taking sides to a degree. And the story Boys in the Valley is all about what happens when that occurs, and the violence and terror that ensues until the bitter end.
The way the book's described on Amazon, it basically talks about how Peter is at this orphanage, and something bad goes down one night, and something evil is kind of released and is infecting the orphanage, and then subsequently the children. And so really, it plays out a lot like, possession story. So do you have a fascination with possessions, or do you kind of enjoy that type of story? Because I feel like that's kind of having a little bit of a resurgence lately, maybe.
Possession stories? Um,
Yeah.
no, no, not really. I think this is the only time I've written a possession. I don't know if it's the only one I've written, but I don't write a lot of possession stories. And and while there are elements of possession, I guess, in the book, um, it's really never stated. So it's kind of the manifestation of evil, if you will, um, that takes place in the story, is never really spelled out. It's always fairly ambiguous as to, um, what exactly is causing the children to act the way they act, and uh, to what degree the visitors who come in the night um, have affected the children
Mhm.
who are affected. So yeah, I don't see it personally as a possession story. I totally get why people would classify it that way. I definitely see it more as um, a story where innocence is corrupted by a sort of outside malevolent force. But I don't know if it's, but I wouldn't call it necessarily possession as much as I would influence, if you will. But yeah, but it's kind of right. It kind of rides those rails for sure.
That's actually perfect, because I was trying to think of the way that I was usually I try to kind of explain the story to myself so that I know I've got like a solid idea of what I've just read. And especially toward the later part of the book, the thing that I kind of came away with was that it's um, it's the influence of good or the influence of evil on a person, and what they do from that is kind of what I felt, because obviously there's an influence of evil aspect, which is, big, kind of larger than life. But there is the other side of the coin, which is Peter, who ostensibly this is Peter's story, um, is one of the older orphans, and he wants to become a priest, but he's got his own kind of personal conflicts with exploring, love and affection and things because he's a teenager. So we also see the kind of influence of good and how that causes people to act too. So I'm actually kind of happy that we kind of pivoted away from possession to kind of talk more about that, because I feel like that was kind of my bigger influence, or not, excuse me, my bigger impression walking away from it was more like what we do with the influences, either good or evil.
Yeah, I definitely think each character has their own response to the the presence that is kind of is dwelling the halls of St. Vincent's Orphanage. Um, and I think it's a very good point to say that there are characters who go completely one way, most likely because of what they have, because of what something they already have inside of them, whether it be hate or anger or a desire for vengeance or whatever, the hostility. And then there's people like Peter who maybe has more of a shield versus that sort of thing because of his character, um, and because of his desires and his motivations. And then there's characters like David, who you can kind of sense throughout the book that there's a conflict within him as to how to respond to what's happening, and even more so the character of Brother Johnson, who who really who really kind of
Yeah.
rides the spectrum of good and evil, and really has a lot of inner turmoil that that pulls him different ways. He has guilt, he has menace, but he also has this kind of weird goodness inside him. So that's hard to that's not obvious. So yeah, so that's a great way to put it. Is they all have their own sort of way of responding, and then there's also a little bit of mob mentality to the story and to what happens with the children, and how leaders emerge and all that sort of stuff. And that's kind of where it comes. I think that's where it's that, and them being children in an isolated setting, I think, are why people, reviewers and whatnot, mention Lord of the Flies, because there's that sort of like kids picking sides sort of thing. Um, but yeah, so it's definitely present. I haven't actually read Lord of the Flies. I'm kind of interested to read it now that this book has come out. Because but I've just seen a lot of that in the reviews and stuff. I know it's a Golding book, but for whatever reason I never picked it up. But I am curious to read it though, and see how Golding handles a bunch of kids in a bad situation.
Yeah. And oh man, and I read that it was likely, in middle school or whatever, so probably multiple decades ago by now. So whatever impression I had is very, very faded. But yeah, I've seen that comparison too. And reading the book, it makes sense why people would like it. Kind of like me saying the possession thing. It's kind of a shorthand for a concept or something, an easy way to kind of
Yeah,
express something.
I think Nightfire's tagline is "The Exorcist meets Lord of the Flies." I think that's how they're marketing the book. So,
Yeah.
which is fine. I get to cross the major, I think, thematic elements of the story pretty well. That elevator pitch, yeah,
Yeah. And now, like you said, kids in a bad situation. What I thought was cool about the setting being an orphanage and being what is it? It's early 1900s, right? Did I
yeah.
get that?
It's like
Yeah, yeah,
1905, yeah,
yeah. Is that their kind of whole life is just like they've never had it good. We get some backstories in various amounts of detail for the different boys that are there, and it seems like the kind of theme is they got there for because something bad happened in their lives, and then it's not a fun place to be. You don't eat a lot of
right.
food. There's a lot of rules. You have to work. It's not fun. It's just very strict and grueling. So then my thought was, if I was in that situation as a kid, how much will would I have to try to overcome like an even worse thing? Like, would I already be kind of worn down to the point where I was like, well, forget it. I just don't care. So
Yeah, yeah.
it's an interesting setting.
I think there's a susceptibility the kids have to um, the evil that infests the orphanage because they are so worn down. They are malnourished. They are um, the downtrodden and the outcast of society. They've all had their own. To your point, they all have their own stories. Some of which I get into, some of which I don't. But yeah, so I think they're kind of sponges for something that gives them a sense of strength or a sense of initiative or a sense of agency. And I think that when that is released among them, I think that it's a perfect storm of like that wide open window of susceptibility that the kids have, and this incredible evil that shows up at their doorstep. So I think that it's an explosive sort of combination with that, which in turn makes the book itself so incredibly dark, because of
Yeah.
because of how they respond to it, and it's and it's I think the idea of picking sides is was one that I enjoyed kind of playing with amongst the different boys and sort of their personalities, and trying to decide who went which way. And so yeah, that was it. Added a layer of sort of suspense, I think, to the terror, because you never weren't really sure who was who was in which camp until the very end. And some
Hmm.
at least with some of the characters, yeah.
Yeah. And talking about it being dark, like I was thinking about starting this conversation just being like, Jesus, man, because there are there's some scenes that are really pretty intense, pretty graphic and stuff. But I don't think that
Yeah.
it's ever in a gratuitous way. It's always in like a, like the way it's written is
Well, it's a little gratuitous.
okay. Well,
It's
but
okay.
okay,
I
that's
don't mind being a little. I
fair.
don't mind being a little gratuitous. It is a
But
horror novel.
in a starkly real way, not in a like a
Right. It's
glorification
not
way.
cartoon.
It's
It's
like,
not cartoony. No. Right.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, but and this is the first thing I've read from you, but you're one of those people that's always been on my orbit, and I see these beautiful covers, and I'm always head down in like four other things, and so like that's my lame apology for not knowing your work more. But from
Mhm.
listening to you on other things, that's definitely something it seems like you don't shy away from, is getting pretty real with the gruesome parts of things, right?
Yeah, that's. I think if I have a calling card or of sorts for my stories, is they're pretty. My stories are very character driven, which is not necessarily the most common thing when it comes to the horror genre. Um, and they're also very grounded for the most part. Most of my stories are very grounded in reality and very real emotions and very real thoughts and feelings that readers quickly connect with. Um, and then I write pretty visceral uh, horror, um, and I think that readers are greatly affected by that because they're now invested in these characters, um, that are three-dimensional and living, breathing people, and I'm described, sometimes in explicit detail, what happens to the characters in my stories, and there's a sort of like dark glee that I feel doing those kind of things, but obviously it's what I do for a living. But yeah, so I think that it's more impactful a lot of times. I think to the point where I get with some of my stories and some of my books, I get a lot of angry reviews. I get a lot of angry readers because they feel like because I've upset people, and um on a level to the extent that they've, like I'm ruining people's days kind of thing. So, um, but hey, welcome to the party, pal. Right? It's horror. So, yeah, I don't mind doing that. I don't mind ruining people's days, but because I think it's all part of entertainment, and and I like to deliver what people are paying for, and so yeah, but that's I think reason I tend to get very visceral. What like I said when I'm describing sort of the things that are happening, and I have a certain way of that I do that. But yeah, but my main focus is always the characters first, really building up the setting, really getting the reader immersed in that world and with those characters, and then kind of pulling the rug out and bringing the horror in, and that's that's kind of when things get fun.
The building a connection to the characters, making the readers care about the characters. In the beginning, it was a little bit through flashbacks to like before the kids were in the orphanage and stuff. So you're actually seeing what's happening to them, and then Peter has nightmares throughout the story. So we get to kind of again flashback to, or just get an image of the things that scare him or worry him. Um, so yeah, that's one of the things I noticed about the book was that the attention to making me care about characters, even if it was a character that didn't appear too much, like what was it, that character Ben? I think Ben went in the hole at one point as a punishment, and it wasn't he wasn't set up a ton before that, but there was enough setup of that character that when that kid had to get punished, like I was feeling the anxiety of like, oh man, I felt bad for that kid. So yeah, I have to give you credit for even if it's like a smaller character, a smaller thread, it's still done enough where I'm in that kid's shoes freaking out like that kid's freaking out.
Yeah, and that was thank you. And that was one of the challenges of writing this book was there are, which we mentioned before we went live, there are a lot of characters in the book. And as a writer, it's a very challenging thing to try and create to try and get, to almost create these tiers of characters where okay, well I really need the reader to be focused on these guys, these like four or five guys, but I really want them to feel something about these like five or six guys, and then the other like dozen or so I need just enough so that they can and picture them a little bit, so when they walk into a room they know who I'm talking about. So there's and so it's tricky to do that. But and some of that is done through dialogue, um, through voice, through character voice. Some of it is done through description, um,
Mm-hmm.
and but even going so far as to choosing the names, um, that also comes into it a little bit. You want a distinctive name goes a long way, for example, or a distinctive accent, the way they talk or whatever.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's a few characters like that where I had to just give you guys just enough, being you the readers, just enough so that you would care and or at least know who I'm talking about, because I think there's 30 kids and I think five priests, and then if I'm my math is I might be missing a priest. I'm not sure. So there's a lot of and there's other characters that kind of come and go. So yeah, there's a lot of characters to keep track of, but yes, the feedback I've gotten so far from people is that it's pretty. I was somewhat successful in that aspect of it, but it was a lot of fun to do that. I really enjoyed it. It wasn't a chore at all. I loved the challenge of that, and it's not something I would shy away from doing again. Um, and I don't like writing period pieces because it is such a pain in the ass to write a period piece, but and I just got done writing a Civil War novel that's coming out in 2024. But Civil War era novel, I should say. But the this was a little bit easier in the sense that it was one, what we call in the film business, you're one location, so you don't have to worry
Right.
about cities or cars or a lot of that kind of stuff that you sometimes have to worry about with writing period pieces. But so yeah, no, but thank you. It was, yeah, the characters were fun, and it was fun to give them their personalities, and even to such an extent as so so when two characters are conflicting, that you almost have like a rooting interest to some extent as a reader, um, and maybe even are a little bit surprised at times as to how a character responds.
Yeah.
Uh, Based on what you know about them so far. So yeah, it was a fun. it was a fun exercise. But yeah, it is definitely a character driven story, but I think it moves pretty quickly so that you never really get I never really get too much into any backstory, or I'm not a fan of slowing things down in my books. I really just like go, 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 go. I'm not a big like, okay, well, let's stop at story A and let me take you back now. Let me completely change gears and make you invest in completely different characters and a completely different setting. That always is something I'm not a huge fan of in books. So I try not to do that in mine. I just like to keep it going full throttle, the whole way.
Yeah. One specific example that comes to mind where we're talking about these characters, and it's not necessarily. It's just maybe it's just a moment that I really enjoyed, but the kid who likes snakes, and I can't remember the character's name, but there's a kid. He's outside and he's getting lured to like a shed, um, and it's early enough in the story where we don't like nobody should know really there's anything potentially wrong. So maybe he's at the worst he's thinking maybe I'll get bullied or something. But as readers,
Right.
we've known enough where we're like, this might not be good. So like, there's a little bit more for as a reader for us to know than that kid. Um, but they lure him in by talking about how they caught a big snake, and uh, that like the back story on that kid liking snakes happens in that scene, but it was still enough to like make it feel authentic. So whatever you did, and I don't remember specifically how you did it, um, like I do the exact same thing as that kid did in that scene. Like you really did a good job of
Yeah.
helping me identify with that kid. So if I had to point to a specific example, I'd say that's one where it was like pulled off quick in the moment and still like gave you like the impact of what you wanted it to for a character.
Yeah. A lot of times, as a writer, I prey upon, um, what's the best way to put it? Sort of common denominator, um, life moments. like, so we've all gone to, when I say we all, speaking generally, obviously, but we've all gone to a circus at one point in our lives. We've all gone to a community swimming pool at one point in our lives. We've all ridden in the back seat of the car while our parents argued. These kind of things are common denominator character traits that I like to give my characters, because I'm gonna hook 90% of my readers into that feeling, and it's an instant empathy connection.
Right.
Um, I wrote a story called Alter, that's in my first story collection, Behold the Void, and which is about this family that goes to a community swimming pool on a Saturday afternoon, and I really dive into, no pun intended, I really dive into like a lot of the little moments that I know are are things that most people have experienced, and that really hooked people into that story and really got them invested immediately into the feeling of that story, the sights, the smells, the sounds, all that stuff. And then when the horror hits, it's like, oh my God, this is awful, because I've just completely like annihilated your childhood memories. And I'm laughing the whole time. But so the snake thing is another one, I think, where it's just an easy connecting point for me to kind of create like an instant empathy, um, with, not obviously not everyone has an affinity for snakes, but everyone's seen a snake. Everyone's seen it. I think the way I describe it in the book is, at one point he had seen like he'd come across a snake while, I think, while working a field or something, and he was fascinated by it.
Hmm.
But yeah, so I do like those little, it's just better to show than tell when you're developing characters. And I think you can say like, oh, he was a nice kid, or he was a good kid, or he was a bad kid, or he had a bad temper or whatever. But I think it's better to have an example of that character trait versus informing the reader in the text. So that's another thing that I try and do with the characters, to try and make them really more very quickly fully fleshed out and also distinctive from one another, to a degree.
Yeah, that's I hadn't really ever thought about it that way, but doing the giving a character a personality trait or a characteristic or whatever that is like the most easy to connect with is damn smart. And I don't know why I never really thought to think of it that way before, but yeah, I got to imagine that sometimes if you're feeling disconnected from a story, it's because you just don't have like a personal like reference point to like connect with, to understand, to like your emotional, your not emotion, your empathy kind of connection or something. So yeah, that's hadn't thought about that, but it's
Yeah,
obviously effective.
and sometimes that's okay. Sometimes I don't want you to connect with the character. Sometimes I want the character to be a little bit more, um, like even a main character. Sometimes I want them to be a little bit more, feel a little bit more distant. Um, and in that sense, it's because I want you to be more, as a reader, I want you more focused on the story versus the characters I'm talking about. I really want you focused on, um, what's happening. And it's just a kind of a different way of doing it. But yeah, but like so I'll keep, sometimes I'll keep a character purposely not two dimensional, but purposely mysterious.
Hmm.
So so that you don't really, so that you're like, okay, well, I don't really know what's going on with this person, but look at this thing they just dug out of the ground. Like that's interesting. So it's sort of a way that there's different ways to play. The unkind way to say it is there's different ways to manipulate a reader, but the kind way to say it is there's different ways um, to construct a story so that, so the readers, you're kind of, it's a little bit of a sleight of hand as a writer. You're kind of like,
Yeah.
I don't want you looking at this, I want you looking at this, but later on that's going to come into play, and it's going to work for me when I do this reveal or whatever. So and or yeah, so or sometimes the character will do something unexpected because I, or it kind of cuts into the unreliable narrator to a degree sometimes, where you think but you don't really know what the character is thinking and feeling. So there's a lot of different ways, a lot of really different fun ways to kind of construct um, the story world to
Yeah.
give a reader a different experience. Yeah.
I keep so in my not reading books and doing podcast world, I'm a trainer, like a corporate trainer. And so
Mm,
a lot of my day is figuring out how do I make you understand stuff you don't care to learn. And so like
mm.
I definitely develop techniques where, I'm like, how do I make their brain do the thing I want? And so when you were just talking about that, I was like, oh yeah, I know. I can understand that totally because I have to manipulate
Yeah,
people 40 hours a week.
that's a tough. Yeah, that's a tough gig, man.
Yeah. It's
Corporate training. Yeah.
but it's the same thing that you said. Like I've got little tricks in my pocket where I know this type of person, and in this situation to get the result, I have to do this thing, not that thing. So yeah, you
Yeah.
just develop over time you develop skills to get to the result you want. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And it definitely is something that I've developed more uh, over the over the years. Where I've learned how to do different things based on feedback that I get from certain stories, and and what works and what doesn't work, and how because you never really know when you write something how people will respond to it.
Yeah.
You can write something that you think is genius and like a total knocked it out of the park kind of deal, and you'll get a very lukewarm response from readers, and generally speaking, and then you'll write something where you kind of feel like it's fine, it's something I did quickly or whatever, and like people go crazy for it. Like I'm always I shouldn't say I'm always surprised, but I'm often surprised by um responses to stories. And even Boys in the Valley, early on, there were some early readers who were like, "You can't publish this book. Um,
Oh yeah.
like you can't. Yeah, no one's going to buy this book," kind of thing. it's way too dark and violent, and the children on children violence and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, bullshit, man. That's the oldest story there is. And but so and then there were some readers who were like, this is brilliant, or whatever, and I love those readers more. But yeah, so it's interesting. You never really know how people will respond. I just finished a book. I just turned in a book. This I told mentioned it, the Civil War book. I just turned it in to my editors. It's coming out next June, and I'm very anxious to see what people think of it because no one's read it yet. And I sometimes as a writer, you don't really know. Like, and also with me, this might be something that is more of a personal thing, but I tend to um, I tend to try different things. I really like experimenting with different styles, with different voices, with different story structures. I don't like standing still, and I don't like repeating
Mhm.
myself for the most part. So I'm always trying to write a story a different way or a way I've never written it. Um, and this is an example of that where I went, really the novel I just turned in, was written in a way that I've never written a novel before, and so yeah, so you just don't know. You're very curious. I'm very curious to see what people think of it. Um, but yeah, but it's one of those mysteries of being a writer that you don't know till people tell you.
Yeah, I have to imagine too that I mean I've talked to dozens of writers over the years, and they probably all have their own very unique ways of having relationships with the stuff they've written. Like I know that there's some people who are just almost like cheerleaders from not cheerleaders, but um like I this is my baby. I can't wait for you to experience it or something.
Yeah.
And there's other people who like probably have a much more distanced like yeah, there's no one way to feel about something once it's done and out in the world. So yeah.
Well, I mean, it's like anything. It's like being when you're, I mean, not to sound like, you know, um, poshy spice, but when you're creating art, you have to create, when you're a painter or a musician or a writer, you create the best art that you can, using your own basically set of tastes, as the barometer of whether something is good or not. It's all you really have to rely on is what do I think? Do I think this is good? So you can only do so much, and you write something that you think is good, that you would want to read, that you think is entertaining or powerful or gets across whatever you're trying to get across, and then also you can work really really hard at making it the most professional product you can. It's
Right.
edited and proofread and it has a great cover or whatever. um and or if you're a musician, you record it to the best of your ability and you mix it to the best of your ability, whatever that. So there are things you can do, but to a certain extent, you're relying on your own set of, what you think of as, I hate to use words good or bad, but to what you think of as good or bad. And it's different than quality because you can have a really you can be a great writer but not be a great storyteller.
Yep. Yeah.
So so anyway, and you're never going to please everybody. No, you know not everyone likes the Mona Lisa. Not everyone thinks the Mona Lisa is the greatest painting ever painted. But it sure is popular, right? Um, but not everyone's going to like your book. Not everyone's going to like your song. Not everyone's going to like your painting. And to expect that is to be naive and ignorant of the way of the real world. But what you do hope for is that there are enough people who enjoy what you've created that you can make a living doing it and
Yeah.
continue to
Keep
do it,
going.
and then enough, right, and then you can sell enough stories so that you can write more stories. And so it's a strange thing, but then there are readers who, I mean, that's where the whole cult thing comes in, right? Like there are readers like, writers like Legati who aren't really mainstream per se, but they have such a hardcore following that they
Yeah.
continue to live throughout the decades. Um, all that to say is that I think when any writer, you just hope that, a majority of people who read it like it, and the people who don't like it don't like it because it's not to their taste, or it's not something they can a story they connect with or whatever, and not that they hate, maybe dislike the writing or whatever, the things you can control. But again, but then but then there, for whatever reason, I mentioned this earlier, for whatever reason, with a lot of my work, there's definitely I get a lot of anger when it comes to my work. And I'm not sure why that is, but I do think it's unusually, people tend to get unusually emotional about my work. And I'm not 100% sure why, but I tend to get a lot of very like, a lot of, exaggerated responses to sometimes to
Huh.
some of my stuff. But I guess it's a good thing. I don't know. But, but yeah,
No,
I just,
no
all I hope
press
is that
is, yeah.
more people, yeah, people either really tend to either really like it, or really, or they're really mad at me for what I did. But Boys in the Valley, I think, is a very commercial book. It's probably my most commercial book, um, even though it's horror. At least my most commercial book to date. So I'm hoping that it gets sort of more of a wider readership, than maybe some of my more, like Gothic, for example. One of my other novels is pretty old school horror, very much purposely so. I think a lot of mainstream readers don't really know what to do with that book. Whereas I think Boys in the Valley will be a little more, digestible to folks who don't necessarily read a lot of horror. That's the hope, anyway.
Yeah.
Although it is
And
pretty dark, so I don't know. I could be
it's
wrong.
dark. Well, here's the thing too. You never know how you're going to find your audience, right? So, you might have that one that opens people up to you as an author, and then they go back and they read other stuff, and they're like, why the hell didn't I find this, when it came out, so,
Yeah,
there's a I've I've been podcasting about books since the early 2011, and I've seen such kind of crazy shifts in like fan bases for authors. So yeah, I mean, but that's, a lot of it is out of your control. You wrote the book, you can promote it, but you can't go up to every person and say, "Hey, do you like these things? This might be a book you enjoy." So yeah, like, you just gotta
yeah, and
hope it lands well.
yeah, and I think I'm the kind of author, and I'm okay with this, that I think my books will be very case by case with readers, which may be a detriment to my long term career. But I'm not one of those. I'm not like Riley Sager or whatever. Where like, oh well, if you read one, you can go back and read all the other ones, and you're gonna, it's all this kind of the same style of book. Which is fine. Riley Sager is doing very well. I think with me, like I said earlier, for me to stay interested in my own work and to create what I feel are interesting stories, I always want to experiment. I always want to be trying something new. I have a book that hasn't been announced yet that's coming out in 2025. That's a science fiction thriller that's pretty much hard sci-fi, and is really not. I would not classify it in any way, shape, or form as horror.
Yeah.
I have another book that my agent has and is currently shopping around, which I would say is more of a mainstream thriller. It's not. I don't. It's not really horror. So, but then I have another book I want to. My next book will definitely be horror. So, I like I said, I like to kind of do. I like to play in different sandboxes. I wrote a book called "Don't Let Them Get You Down," which is this one right here,
Mhm.
which is not genre at all. It's a novel about depression and anxiety. Um, so I just like to kind of write what I want to write. Where I think horror. I kind of think of horror as sort of my home base. It's kind of
Mhm.
something I like to return to, and I think all my stories, even that one I just mentioned, they're all they all sort of reside in the dark side of the universe. But yeah, but it's for me. I like to do different things. I like to challenge myself, and who knows? Maybe I can find like a sci-fi readership and a horror readership, and and I'll have a couple different places to sell my things. But but yeah, for me it's funner to change it up. So I do think that, and even my
Mhm.
horror books vary widely. Child and Always Strangers is a 600-page crime procedural, you know, kind of like creature feature hybrid. Gothic is very much an old school hardcore horror book, and Boys in the Valley, I think, feel of as being a little more mainstream, like I said. So, and that there's no there's no reason for any of that other than that's how whatever I feel like writing at the time is what I write. And like I said, I like to go in knowing what kind of book I'm writing. One of the
Hmm.
first things I think of before I start a book is what is the tone that I want this book to have. Um, and once I establish the tone, then I begin the actual story construction. But for me, it always starts with tone. Um, what kind of feeling do I want people to have reading this book? So that's always
Cool.
the most important thing for me. Yeah.
Huh. So when you were saying that, one of the authors that came to mind that I feel he probably has kind of a vein of the same kind of feeling he gives you in his writing, but it does seem like it's kind of varied as Brian Evanson. Like, um, from the stuff I've read, at least, like it goes to kind of extremes of like being more sci-fi, being more horror,
Yep.
being just
Yep.
like kind of down the middle. But man, that guy, not only can that guy write so like ridiculously well, he always tells you happy birthday on Facebook without fail every year. So that's
Brian
my
is Brian is one of the nicer guys you'll ever meet, and he's a good friend of mine, and he's a wonderful writer. And yeah, no, and for sure, like he does sci-fi, he does what I would call almost surrealist
hmm
um, literature, surrealist fiction, and then he does straight up horror. Yeah, body horror. He's big into body horror.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, he goes to, but you hit the nail on the head, which is everything he writes is of such quality that you don't really mind. Um, not really, I shouldn't never mind, but you don't mind him switching around the genres on you because it's always a Brian Evanson story. And he also writes,
Yeah.
speaking of Brian, he also writes a lot of like movie tie-in stuff.
Yeah.
Under BK Evanson, he wrote like some Alien stuff, and he wrote wrote a Rob Zombie adaptation, and he actually even wrote an original novel called Fear. Is it Feral, like the cat, like a like a feral creature. Anyway, he
hmm
wrote a book called Feral, which was based on a screenplay of a movie that was never made. So he does some he gets around. Yeah, he does some wild
Yeah.
stuff, but he's a wonderful writer and an even more wonderful human being. He's such a great guy.
he is. I'll tell you my quick two little things where this guy won me over like crazy. I got the opportunity to interview him
Mm-hmm.
two different times in my old podcast. The first time, so we had scheduled it, whatever. The day comes, we get on the call, and he says, my voice might be a little bit off or scratchy or whatever. I just had throat surgery yesterday.
Oh no,
And we're like, do you need to reschedule? Like, this sounds
right,
important. And he's like,
right,
no, I'm
yeah,
sure it'll be fine. And he was totally gracious about it. And
yeah.
I was like, wow, this guy's really gracious. The second time I talked to him, we scheduled it in advance. The day comes, gets on the call, and he just anecdotally says like, "Oh, my kid was born yesterday," or something like that. Like my baby was
I was
born
going to
yesterday.
say he probably does. I was going to make a joke about how he got on the call and said his wife was giving birth, but
Yeah,
you beat me to it. Yeah,
but and
that's
like and
funny.
I'm like, "Oh man, we can do this another time." And he's like, no, it's cool." And he's just he's always been my impression of that guy.
Yeah,
Besides being brilliant, is
yeah,
just like he's so good. He's a good dude.
he's a good dude. Yeah, he teaches at Cal Arts here and here in the Southern California area, and I got to speak to his class once, and he and
Oh,
I have
nice.
lunch regularly and catch up, and he's going to be actually at my. Speaking of Boys in the Valley, I'm doing the book launches here in Los Angeles at this local store called the Village Well, and Brian's gonna do like a Q&A with me for the launch event.
Awesome.
So I'm very excited that I get to have my launch event with one of my friends there with me, make me less nervous. But yeah, so good guy, great writer.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to steer back to the book in a second, but talking about Brian made me think about um, the Writers Guild and the strike and how you do screenwriting, right? So are you
Yeah.
involved in the striking and all that that's going on right now?
I'm very indirectly involved. I'm more involved as a fiction writer than I
Hmm.
am as a screenwriter because I'm as a screenwriter I'm not WGA.
Okay.
So for folks who may not know, Writers Guild of America, if you're it's a union. So if you are a screenwriter and you write for union films, meaning bigger movies, not necessarily huge movies, they're not, but but movies with a real budget and that kind of stuff, you are probably a WGA. You're in the union. You're a union writer, unionized writer. I'm actually a Teamster, so
Gotcha.
I'm in the Teamster union because I work in film production, because I used to, but I am still technically a Teamster. But but because I'm not a screenwriter, I'm not a WGA member. It doesn't really affect me in the sense of writing screenplays because I can still write screenplays if I want to, as long as it's not a WGA contract or I'm not scabbing
Gotcha.
something. But I mean, right
Right.
now we're none of us are writing screenplays because it's just like we don't want to feed anything. We don't want to feed any product necessarily into the studios because we want the writers to get the WG because we want them to get what they're asking for. So it's better just to do a hard stop on everything. But as a
Right.
fiction writer, it's affecting me very much in this sense because I just happen to have um, a few pending deals that are for film and TV that are based on my fiction that are now all kind of on hold. Um, so that's kind of a negative for me
Yeah.
um, because I'm not WGA, so I'm not really getting anything out of the strike in that sense. But I am being affected negatively. My career is being and my bank account are being negatively affected because I'm not able to make these deals. But it's a sacrifice I'm totally happy to make because I hope to one day be WGA, and then I'll be very happy that the strike went through. And I have
Right.
a lot of friends who are in the union, and I want them to have what. I mean, it's all very positive, so I don't mind it. I don't mind sacrificing in the short term if it helps to if it means they get the deal done. But that's the only way it really affects me. It affects me much more as a fiction writer than it does as a screenwriter.
That makes sense. And just thinking back to whenever that was, the writer strike was in like 2008, late 2000s sometime, where
Yeah,
that had
2008.
really
Yeah.
like cataclysmic effects on uh, projects, like existing shows, projects
Yep.
getting made at all. Like it was really, there was ripples that kind of hit everyone. So like the
Yeah, well,
longer the, yeah.
I was gonna say that was when reality TV really took off. That's when your
No.
Duck Dynasty stuff really became a bigger piece of the pie because studios were scrambling for content, and so they just started doing
Yep.
reality TV shows. Um, yeah, that was a long strike. I think that was 100 days, if memory serves, and I don't know how long this one's going to go for. My gut is it's probably going to go through the summer. I'm hoping it won't last much longer than that. But after 4 months of striking, um, things are start getting dicey because without getting too into it, but basically all the movies that are slated to come out are either have been made or are being made. But in about 4 months, probably 3 months now, because the strike's been
Yeah.
going on for a few weeks, um, the studios are going to run out of content. So they're not going to have any new movies to put into theaters or put on TV because they'll have used up their surplus, if that makes sense. So
Right.
that's
Right.
kind of when things are going to come to a head. So I'm hoping it won't last that long. I don't know, but yeah, it's important that the writers get exactly what they're asking for. It's super the compensation. We don't want to get into the whole WJ thing, but the compensation between what studios and producers are getting and what writers are getting is stupid sauce. So that needs to be balanced a bit better because Without content, there is no content, and the writers are the ones who are creating all the content. So
Yeah.
um, we're an important part of that machine.
Yeah. Yeah, I just, oh man, I hadn't really even thought about the greater impacts of like what it affects, but yeah, once they run out of like stuff that's like in production or post production or whatever, there's also going to be that gap of like we need to start creating stuff to catch up. So yeah, like yeah, it's a
Yeah, and
whole
you can't do reshoots, and you can't like look. When I wrote a movie called Girl Missing that was on Lifetime I don't know, now I guess it's a decade ago. But I was on that set for while we were in Minnesota for a month, and filming that movie, and I was writing new pages, and that was a feature film. That wasn't a TV show. That was a feature, and I was writing new pages basically every night for the next day's shooting. So that's how much rewriting it goes into a feature. And if I've worked in production for 20 years, and every day, nearly almost every day, you get a PA walks around every morning and hands out what we call sides, which are tiny little script pages. And the sides are changed. They're always like, here's the new pages, because everyone needs to know.
yeah.
Crew members need to know what the new pages are, because it's not just dialogue. It affects equipment, it affects locations, it affects lots of things. So point being is that yeah, you can't even rewrite stuff like now. Like so, even movies that are in production, like they have to go by the script that is written. They can't change the script um, because they can't, because that's part of that's breaking the strike. So yeah, so it's an incredibly complex, difficult time in the entertainment industry, and I just hope it gets resolved soon, and the studios share a little bit of their wealth.
Yeah, I'm definitely an outsider on that, but obviously in solidarity with the writers. And yeah, hopefully resolving that soon.
Well,
Didn't
now the actors are going on strike too, so who knows what's
yeah.
going to happen.
Oh man. um, Podcasts will get more popular.
Yeah, there'll be a lot
That's a
more
joke.
podcasting.
Going back to the story really quick, because it came up toward the beginning of our discussion about the book, that one of the things that I kind of ticked away to ask about was that the evil in the book, and correct me if I don't explain this right, but is kind of intentionally ambiguous. You don't really go into, we don't name the thing, we don't explain how it works. And I feel like that was an effective way to do it in this book, because then it puts it more on not what is this thing, what are the mechanics of it. It's more on what do the characters do because of it. So I don't know if there's a question there, but I'm assuming that was kind of your goal, was keep the focus on the characters, not necessarily on this thing that is really kind of just pushing the story. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's yeah. I mean, there are. I mean, in my mind, with that, I'm trying not to be spoilery. In my mind, like you mentioned possession at the beginning of our conversation, like in my mind, there is an argument to be made that what happens in this book has no supernatural element whatsoever. Um,
Nice.
one could make that argument, and you'd get it'd be a difficult argument to win, but you could make that argument. And there is a part of me that was very purposefully suggesting that throughout this story, that there is not it's not necessarily a slam dunk story of of the supernatural, or a supernatural occurrence. Now there are things that would be brought into question, like, okay, but what about X, Y, and Z? And those would be parts of the argument and the debate. But you could at least make the case that given some pretty wild circumstances, um, it's not a story of supernatural demonic possession or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So all that to say that yes, you're correct in that it's really about um, how these characters are affected by, I kind of think of it as they're given a bit of a, they're all kind of standing on the edge of this cliff and looking down into this abyss. And I think there's sort of a, think of it as sort of like and I think in the book I actually describe it a little bit of, there's sort of like a strong wind comes and some of the
Yeah.
kids get blown over the side and some of the kids stand their ground. And I think that's sort of the way I think about it. If I was to put it into a metaphor, that's kind of how I sort of think about the influence that affects the orphanage. Is it's sort of like this strong wind, and depending on how susceptible some of the children are to that, what the wind is carrying, it kind of affects each one differently. So that's, yeah. So you could definitely say it's ambiguous. It is there. There is no the ghost is in the machine kind
Right.
of thing. Like it's very veiled, but I think it's satisfyingly enough. I don't think there's a satisfyingly enough of a story. There's no it's not ambiguous to the point where I don't know as the writer, because sometimes you read a story and you're like, and there's an ambiguous ending, and it's upsetting because you're like, the writer obviously didn't know how to end the story, so they just created this sort of ambiguous ending. This is not that story, but
Right.
I definitely know what's happening, and I think most readers do too. You could sort of, if one had the desire to have that debate, you could have that debate, I think.
Yeah. Now that I was thinking, I was kind of analyzing my memory of the story as you were saying that, and two things. I can't think of a moment where I'm like, no, this breaks that ambiguous interpretation. But the other thing is, yeah, you could really see it if you wanted to, if you chose to believe this, that it's like a scary thing happened one night, and then there was an epidemic of disobedience, like that could realistically be like that was
Especially
the straw
given,
that, yeah,
yeah, and there's a lot of references to some of the violence that some of the kids had to endure, um,
yeah,
you know, under the guardianship of the priest, and even though there's no like sexual assault or anything like that. It's nothing like that. But there, it's a
yeah,
strict it's a strict setting. And you made the point early on. These kids come from broken. These are broken kids. These are kids who have been abandoned, who have been outcast, who have been orphaned, who have And in those days, when a lot of those kids who were if you weren't at an orphanage, you were being sold, or even if you were at an orphanage, you were being sold to a factory as labor
yep,
at the ripe age of 12 or 11. So, so it was a not a great time to be a kid, when you didn't have money or guardians who took care of you. So yeah, these are all kids who have been through it. Especially our hero,
hmm,
especially Peter, arguably the co-protagonist, if you will, I think, with David. But yeah, he's obviously had a very rough go of it as well. But he responds differently than I think, than a
right,
lot of the kids do, and I think that's part of what I try and get across in the book. Also, speaking of the supernatural, is that the decisions that Peter makes, or that each of the children make, those decisions ultimately, whatever you think about the evil influence, the decisions ultimately are made by the kids themselves.
right,
And some of the decisions are hard decisions, and those aren't guided by some sort of spiritual force. They're not guided by some sort of evil force. They are influenced, yes, but ultimately it comes down to what's inside each one of these characters, and that is what informs their actions, not something outside of themselves. And that's kind of one thing about the book that I feel strongly about, is that ultimately these kids all make up their own minds as to what they're going to do. Are they influenced? Yeah, of course, because everyone's influenced by their surroundings and their environment and their upbringing and all that kind of stuff. But and maybe in this book they're influenced by a little bit more than that. But
Yeah.
ultimately, each of the characters knows what they're doing, which is why I think I shied away a little bit when you mentioned possession at the beginning, because possession sort of
Is a
is
control
like
thing. Yeah.
it's a control thing, and this is not a control thing. These kids are making their own decisions. They just happen to be informed in different ways and influenced in different ways.
That's
At
awesome.
least in my
Yeah.
mind. At least in my mind.
No, it totally
Certainly.
tracks.
Yeah.
And then talking about, I don't know. All right. So if you think that this is too much, well, I'll just cut it out. But um, without revealing anything that happens at the end of the book, um, there was a couple things about it that kind of surprised me. One was that I
Hmm.
definitely in those final paragraphs was crying. So
Sweet.
gave me a real emotional response that I didn't
Yeah.
see coming. So that's fantastic. And then there was like more of a hopefulness than maybe um, I was expecting at the end too. So I don't know if that's just how I took it, or if like maybe that was you were trying to make it baked in a little bit, but there was definitely like more of a feeling of hope than I thought you were gonna sign off with.
Yeah, it's a yeah, I definitely don't want to get into how the book ends, but I will say that the way the book is structured, on the way the story is told, and what I mean by that is the technical way the story is told, the way I construct the chapters and the perspectives, that all is intentional as to how the ending sort of rolls out, um, and how it affects you. But I think the hope thing is, um, I think the hope thing is I wouldn't argue against that. I think if you were to say you felt hope at the end of my novel Gothic, I would question I would question your sanity. But I think that this book, I don't know if I use the word hope as much as I would. There's a very purposeful sense of goodness, I guess, that sort of comes
Yeah.
through
Yeah.
in the ultimately after this. And I kind of put readers through the ringer with this story. So I think by the end you're just kind of hoping for something to hold on to, and yeah, and I think in my own way I do that. So I think that's an appropriate response to have. I don't find it
Yeah.
outlandish
I think the
at
goodness
all.
thing is probably more accurate. All right, we just had a little aside that I had to cut out because it absolutely spoils the end. But that yeah, I'm glad that I got at least some of my thoughts about the ending validated. And then for anybody that's listening or watching, obviously you're going to go get this. You're going to pre-order this book and understand for yourself what I was talking about or what I didn't talk about, I guess. Um, so um, outside of Boys in the Valley, which I think is fantastic, and now I have to go just do a dive into the back catalog. You mentioned a couple of things that are coming up. So what's official that's like kind of coming down that people would look out for after Boys in the Valley? I
Yeah.
know that's just the dumbest thing because it's like you're here to promote that, and I'm bothering you about the next thing, but it's kind of
No, it's great. No, so yeah, anyone, I mean, if you're, you know, on the deep dive front, the novels, I mean, I've had so many books come out recently. So, A Child Alone with Strangers came out last October. Gothic came out this past February from Cemetery Dance. Um, Boys in the Valley comes out July 11th. And then next summer of 2024, I have a novel coming out called Serafina, which is a Civil War era horror novel, which I just turned into my editors a couple weeks ago. And then I have another novel coming out in 2025 that's been sold, that is I mentioned earlier, which is science fiction. That one has not been announced yet. And for those listening, when writers do stuff like I can't talk about it because it hasn't been announced, it's not. Trust me, we would love nothing more to talk about it. It's because um, the publishers have that right to make the initial announcement, and so we have to kind of wait for them to make the announcement, and then once they do, we can talk about it. So yeah, but that'll be coming out. So that's what I have coming out. So I think things. I told you I have too many things coming. And I have a new story collection called "No One Is Safe" that's coming out this October. So it'll be Boys in the Valley in July, No One Is Safe in October, and then Serafina next summer, most likely June, I think is what they're targeting. And then
Yeah.
early 2025 for my sci-fi thriller novel.
Yeah. I thought there was something in the fall. I just couldn't remember what it was.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, the story
This,
collection. Yeah, which I think is a lot of fun. I just went through the edits for the interior yesterday, actually, and I think it's going to be a fun collection of stories. So
nice. And then one thing I want to mention because it's the next conversation I'm having. Yeah, it's the next conversation I'm having. Is you? I think Boys in the Valley specifically got a page in Sadie Hartman's upcoming nonfiction book, 101 Books to Read Before You're Murdered. I don't know if did you know that? You knew that.
I know what's in there. I haven't seen the book.
Yeah.
See, I haven't seen Sadie's book, but Sadie told me a long time ago that she was including it. I was very excited about that. But I haven't seen
Yeah.
how it's referenced or anything like that. I think she has it under like coming of age stories or something. I don't no
Well,
idea. I haven't.
yeah, I have an arc of it, and if I was smart, I
Oh,
would
you
have had
do?
it. I would have had it not in my bedroom. I would have had it sitting next to me. But so I was flipping through it the other
Yeah,
day
take
because
a
I have
picture.
to.
Will you take a picture of it
Yeah.
later
Oh yeah.
and message it to me?
Yeah. Absolutely,
I
I
haven't
will.
seen it. So no, yeah. So
um,
I asked Sadie for an arc, and I think she just got sidetracked. So I didn't get one, but that's okay.
yeah. That. Well. Yeah. I had to jump through hoops. And be a. I'm.
Sadie's great. You're interviewing Sadie next? So
Yeah. Talking to Sadie in a couple of weeks about that, and yeah. So I
cool.
have the arc of it, and man, like it is really cool the way she put it together because kind of like you alluded to, it's kind of broken down by kind of themes of different like types
Hmm.
of horror and stuff, but it's deep diving some specific authors and stuff. It seems like it's pretty well put together, so I get to dive into that next. And she's awesome. She's awesome.
Yeah, she's very cool. She's been a big help to me over the last several years. Promoting my stuff and yeah, we're friends, and yeah, she's a very cool person, and a big promoter of horror. So
Yeah.
it's great that she's doing that, because it's definitely getting people on the map who probably would not be on the map otherwise. So she's doing a great thing.
Yeah, I think that's something that we can all, as readers, because I'm not a writer, I'm a reader and I'm passionate about stories. And that's one of the reasons I do this podcast is because we could talk to each other about it all day long, but really we should be talking to more and more and more people about it. So I think she's really good for being a presence for doing that type of thing.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, for anybody who's watching the video, I'm showing it 101 horror books to read before you're murdered. And then,
Okay, cool.
yeah, so I think it's under the demons and possession category, but you got a whole.
Oh, okay. Oh, well, then I guess I should have not said all that stuff about it not being a possession story, but that's all right.
Well, but it's. I think she generally put it that way, but yeah, like so. There's a whole.
Yeah, it's
It's a
fine.
page. Like
Oh,
so, I was happy to see that you made it into that because I think that this is going to be one of those things. I know there's others like Paperbacks from Hell. Deals Hendricks put that thing together, and it deals with a lot of like the old horror paperbacks and stuff. But
yeah,
this is
yeah,
contemporary horror, so this is stuff that's happening right now. And I think that's going to be a great way to launch people into discovering a ton of people. So I was happy to see that
yeah. It
you got that.
should get a nice wide reach for sure.
Yeah,
It's kind of cool cover. I like the
yeah,
cover.
they did a good job. It's good. So anyway, that was just a little aside. I noted it and I noticed it, and I was like, happy to see that it was part of that. So especially after I
Right
just
on.
read it and it just like the book beat the shit out of me. So now I think everybody needs to get beat the shit out of by this book.
Yeah, but it's entertaining. you'll be it's yeah. I mean, if you're it's a gripping, right? It's a good gripping sort of like page turning thriller, right? But with some pretty intense violence and horror, I
Yeah.
guess. So
And
if you're into that sort
pacing,
of thing,
pacing is great. By the way, I didn't mention it before, but you did say that you wanted to keep it moving, and I will say that pacing is
yeah,
something that it's easy to notice when it's not paced quickly.
yeah,
And I was ripping through it. I kept telling my girlfriend, "Oh, I'm interviewing this person on Friday, and I was reading the book this week." And she's like, "You need to take some time to read." And I'm like, "No, this reads really fast." So,
yeah.
um,
Well, I wrote this is a child alone with strangers. You can sort of see the cover. Look
mhm.
at this is a big book. So
Yeah,
this is 600 pages comparatively to Boys in the Valley. This is twice the length of Boys in the Valley. But what's interesting about this book, and the reason I mentioned this is Gothic, which has the cool scary cover. But
yeah,
what's interesting about the reason I mentioned the Child Alone with Strangers is it's a 600-page book. But one of the comments I get um, from a lot of readers is that it just blew by so fast for them. So
yeah,
I feel like that one I definitely tried to make it like really fast paced and kind of like, I wanted to kind of keep the action going, and I actually play with which I've never done, first time I've done it in a book, but I actually play with tense
hmm,
in that novel. So most people don't realize this happens. At least I haven't heard people mention it. But so the book actually starts in the past tense, and then there's a point in the book where it switches gears into the present tense because things sort of start speeding up, um, action wise. So I think it's
nice.
sort of like almost like a subconscious thing that I'm like, okay, we're going to start moving a little bit faster now, and then by the end, it's I think it's a really just like a straight drop down the roller coaster, the big roller coaster hill. And I think the last 100 pages of that book are pretty intense. So if you like Boys in the Valley, you would really like Child Alone with Strangers.
Well,
It's
that's
it's
getting
kind of
ordered.
more it's kind of more of the same. Yeah,
Yeah,
Gothic is a little different, but I would say Child is similar to Boys in the it's more of like a thriller adventure, fast paced, you know, kind of thing. So, but mileage varies, so who knows?
you just reminded me of one thing I forgot to talk about with Boys in the Valley, and that is that it is almost entirely written in the third person, except for Peter's parts are in the first person.
Yeah.
Am I right about that?
Yeah,
Yeah,
so yeah, Peter's chapters are first person, correct.
yeah,
And all the other chapters are third person with unique POV. So or character.
yep.
So you're in one. You're not. I don't head hop between characters. Each chapter is devoted to one character. Um, so, but yeah, but Peter's chapters are told a little bit differently.
That just kind of made it feel more to me like it was kind of his story primarily. I don't know if there was like a
Yeah,
bigger goal beyond that, but like it made it feel like Peter's telling me this, plus there's more or something like that.
yeah. There's some different reasons why I did it that way, but that's primarily one of them. I mean, this is Peter's story, but it's also yeah, I don't want to color the reading of it for anybody, but
Other reasons.
whether it's Peter's story or someone else's story is another thing that could be debated, um,
Gotcha.
depending on how you look at it.
Oh,
But
interesting. I'll have to think on that.
yeah,
That's cool. Um,
yeah, you think it's Peter's story because of the what you just said,
yeah,
because of the way I just structured it, and but there's an argument to be made that there's another character who I think has just as much agency throughout as Peter. But and by the way, just so people don't get annoyed or listening to this, all this stuff I'm talking about on the technical side, throw it all out the window because it has nothing to do with the reading experience. This is all just stuff that I do on my end, that is should be hopefully totally invisible to the readers when I'm talking about all this character development and structure. And don't worry about any of that stuff, you guys. Just have fun reading the story.
yeah,
that's leave the technical stuff to me. And but the I don't want to it's not the point of any of this the way I write. My goal with writing anything is, um, my number one goal with anything I write is to entertain, and and then emotionally, one way or another, this kind of genre, this kind of genre. That's all secondary to, in my mind, the first thing a book has to be is entertaining, and then from there on, you can have your nuances. But I always want my books to be escapes, not things you have to like
Not like
work at.
homework.
So that's
Yeah.
not like homework. Yeah, yeah,
That's a good point. And I think that's why that I've kind of navigated over the years too. When I'm talking about a book, I usually stick to like themes I noticed in the book and how it made me feel when I'm talking about it, as opposed to
yeah,
really looking at the mechanics of stuff. But
yeah.
sometimes I
That's
like
just
to,
me being a writer. Just me being a writer nerd. I like to talk about that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's all
but
about, like I
yeah,
said earlier, it's about tone, feel, how this book
yeah,
makes you feel. I definitely want, people to have. It's a big bonus for me if people have an emotional response to the work. It's an almost impossible thing to achieve with literature, or fiction, but um, it's very tricky. You can't ham fist it. You have to let the you have to let the reader come to you. You can't bring it to the reader, and there's certainly like an art to it. But
yeah.
entertainment, that I can do. That I know I can do. But it's but the rest of it's kind of like case by case. Yeah.
Well, I definitely endorse that. It's an entertaining book. It's a quick read. It's a good read. It engages you. I could throw a bunch of positives at it, but everything you said, I fully agree with. Well, want to thank you for taking time to talk to someone who you'd never met before this conversation
No, of
about the
course.
book, and for the awesome story. I always do my best to thank authors for their work because I never could fathom how much goes into it. But for me, it's reading for a handful of hours and then being like, it made me feel something. And for you, it's like a real effort. So really appreciate you putting in the time to put out awesome stuff like this.
Yeah, sure, man. Yeah, yes, yeah. 6 months equals about 3 hours is the formula.
That's
Which
crazy.
is always kind of funny when you read people's reviews and they're like, "I hated it, 1 star DNF," and I'm like, "Wow, that was a year of work gone, just
Right.
just like that, boom, gone."
Yeah.
But
Mabel didn't
that's the
didn't appreciate that
that's the
one.
game. No, that's the game. That's the game we play. So it's all good.